Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight: Congresswoman Ilhan Omar receives death threats. Minnesota Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar is under attack yet again. This time, she's in the spotlight for tweets comparing crimes committed by Israel and the United States to those of Hamas and the Taliban. She repeated this claim in a question to Secretary Antony Blinken. On Wednesday, a group of Jewish House lawmakers, including House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler, called the comparison offensive and misguided. While clarifying her tweet, Omar denied making a comparison between democratic countries and terrorist organizations. She said she was citing an open case in the International Criminal Court against Israel, the United States, Hamas, and the Taliban. This, she argued, isn't a comparison based on deep-seated prejudice. On Wednesday, Omar also said she had received death threats over the comments. She said news coverage and GOP lawmakers encouraged the calls for violence. Omar shared the audio of a message left at her office, tweeting, "Every time I speak out on human rights, I'm inundated with death threats." Omar is one of the first two Muslim women to serve in the United States Congress. The United States Senate has confirmed the first Muslim American federal judge by a vote of 81 to 16. Zahid Qureshi is the son of Pakistani immigrants and is a graduate of Rutgers Law School. He gave up his law practice and joined two tours in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2004 and 2006. In 2019, he was appointed as a U.S. magistrate judge for the District of New Jersey. At that time, he became the first Asian American to serve on the federal bench in the state. Dr. Ijaz Ahmed is the chairman of the American Pakistani Public Affairs Committee. He issued a statement saying Qureshi is the model for the outstanding contributions that Pakistanis and Muslim Americans make to America every day. But Qureshi's nomination was not without controversy. Critics in the Muslim community say that Biden's administration sidestepped many American civil rights organizations to nominate him. They were also troubled by his past work as a chief counsel for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Additionally, they raised questions about Qureshi's time in the military as a detention advisor. He was a JAG attorney who oversaw detention policy in Iraq during the time of Abu Ghraib in the Iraq War. 178 workers from the Houston Methodist Hospital system in Texas have been suspended for not meeting a deadline to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. They filed a lawsuit against the hospital and now have till June 21st to get vaccinated or risk being laid off. Their refusal stems from the fact that the vaccines have not yet been fully approved by the FDA. The vaccine has received emergency approval by the FDA, however. Dr. Mark Boom is the president and CEO of Houston Methodist Hospital. He said that the employees' refusal to get the vaccine is based on misinformation. In an email he sent to the hospital employees this week, he said he's hopeful that they will get vaccinated soon. Boom added that more than 600 employees were granted exemptions or deferrals for the vaccine requirement. Yesterday, 10 U.S. senators formed a bipartisan group announcing an agreement on the infrastructure deal. The agreement concerns the framework for spending $1.2 trillion in infrastructure over the next 8 years. Sources said that the focus will be on core physical infrastructure and will not result in largely increased taxes, providing $974 billion over 5 years. The agreement includes a proposal to index gas tax to inflation, which could attract pushback from the Democrats. It would provide $579 billion in funding over what would otherwise be spent without any new legislation. But the deal would still need to be presented to the Senate Republican Conference and the White House for buy-in. Though far from being finalized, it is one of the most recent efforts by the Biden administration that has encouraged bipartisanship. President Biden's announcement that the U.S. will donate 500 million vaccines to lower-income countries was met with Republican approval. In a rare moment of support, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham called it a good investment and said that he supports the donation. This is a departure from the term of former President Donald Trump when the two parties were largely antagonistic towards each other. The Florida Board of Education voted on Thursday to ban critical race theory, or CRT, from classrooms. The final push came from Governor Ron DeSantis. Prior to the vote, he addressed the board, several of whom were his appointees. Many groups, including the Florida Education Association, opposed the rule change. They say it would do a greater disservice to students to cover up the negative aspects of America's history on race. Association President Andrew Spar said students deserve the best education we can provide and that hiding facts doesn't change them. CRT is the practice of questioning the role of race and racism in society. It examines how institutionalized racism supports a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. It acknowledges the legacy of slavery, segregation, and its continued residual impact. Florida followed several states that have stopped or limited CRT from their school curriculum. This has become a major point of contention between parents and local schools. The Chinese government has created a dystopian hellscape on a staggering scale in occupied East Turkestan, or what the Chinese call New Territory, Xinjiang. That is according to a new report by Amnesty International and a campaign highlighting these atrocities. Muslims in occupied East Turkestan face systematic state-organized abuse and oppression. This includes mass imprisonment, torture, and persecution, all of which amounts to crimes against humanity, according to Amnesty. Many countries in the world, including the United States, have recognized it as genocide. The report contains several new testimonies from former detainees, specifically the extreme measures taken by Chinese authorities since 2017. These are designed to eradicate religious traditions, cultural practices, and local languages. Under the pretense of fighting terrorism, Chinese authorities have targeted Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Hui, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Tajiks. The Chinese Communist government has built an elaborate system of surveillance. It has also established a vast network of hundreds of transformation through education centers throughout the Uyghur region. These centers actually serve as internment camps where torture is systematic and authorities forcefully instill secular, homogenized communist ideals. Detainees were taken without warning from their homes for seemingly lawful conduct. This includes possessing a religious-themed picture or communicating with someone abroad. They were first interrogated and tortured at police stations. Then they were hooded, shackled, and transferred to camps. In the camps, detainees listed an extremely strict and regimented schedule focused on re-education and brainwashing with no personal freedoms allowed. After release, former detainees remained under constant surveillance. This included visits extending several days by government cadres to report suspicious behaviors. Muslims are not allowed to practice their religion in the region. Copies of the Quran, prayer mats, and other religious artifacts have effectively been banned. Religious artifacts and photos in homes are replaced by Chinese flags. Mosques, shrines, and grave sites have been demolished. Agnes Callamard of Amnesty International said the international community must speak out and act in unison to end this abomination. A statue of the founder of Canada's notorious Indian residential schools has been pulled down. Videos on social media showed the likeness of Egerton Ryerson being pulled down by rope while a small crowd cheered at Ryerson University in Toronto. It is unclear who was responsible. Another video appeared to show a group of people trying to cut off the statue's head. Earlier this week, it was vandalized with graffiti sprayed all over. Ryerson developed Canada's residential school system to convert and assimilate Indigenous children into white European settler culture. The term school is widely disputed by Indigenous people who say the use of the word softens up the image of these torture centers. Administrators and teachers at these schools physically, sexually, and verbally abused many of the students. About 2 weeks ago, a mass grave containing the remains of 215 Indigenous children was found at a residential school in Kamloops in the province of British Columbia. South Africa and the world has lost a great scholar. The Muslim Judicial Council of South Africa announced the death of the Mufti of the council, Maulana Muhammad Taha Quran. Known for his humility and shunning of limelight, he was a graduate of Darul Uloom Deoband and Al-Azhar University and was called a forward thinker. Quran hails from a family of theologically trained individuals. His mother pursued theological studies in Lahore, Pakistan, while his father was trained at the Darul Uloom Deoband Seminary. His paternal uncle, Maulana Ibrahim Adam, too had studied at Deoband, while his uncle, Dr. Ali Adam, the educationist, was trained at the Nadwatul Uloom Seminary. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Mufti Quran had authored a collection of 40 hadiths, or sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, called Fleeing from Fate to Fate, a hadith on contagion and pandemics. On Friday, he passed away due to complications from COVID. The Burmese military committed the genocide of Rohingya and then took over the government while dismissing civilians. What is the future of the Rohingya in the future politics of Burma? More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
Rohingya and other Burmese Muslims supported Aung San Suu Kyi enthusiastically. They campaigned and voted for her. Well, that includes those who are still allowed to vote. Many Rohingya are denied their voting rights. But they campaigned for Suu Kyi anyway. They hoped their citizenship would be restored. She did not do that. Once in power, she failed to stop Burmese military from committing the genocide of Rohingya. She then went on to defend that genocide in the International Court of Justice. Now that the military has disposed her from power, the secret opposition has formed a national unity government. This shadow government in exile states that they would restore citizenship rights to Rohingya. They proclaim to repeal the controversial 1982 citizenship law and deceptive national verification card system. The United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, welcomed it. The Rohingya, however, are skeptical of this promise. They would like to see Rohingya representatives in the unity government. That would be a true statement of unity for all Burmese, including the Rohingya.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Americans' views about international priorities differ widely by party, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey. But further differences emerge within the party themselves. How do Americans in news media bubbles think differently about foreign policies than others? Let's go to Saleha Farouk for a detailed analysis on recent Pew surveys.
Thank you and much appreciated. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Dr. Gordon Adams, who is a professor emeritus of the United States Foreign Policy, as well as from the American University in Washington. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. I wanted to first start off by asking you that since the Trump presidency, which has perhaps changed the way many people might regard US federal leadership when it comes to events abroad, Republicans are feeling a little bit less certain about the country's national interests in other countries. Talk to us about this potential shift in thinking regarding events abroad as they relate to foreign policy.
Well, there's been a very interesting shift in the last 4 years, partly through the Trump presidency. He's probably the first president that the United States has had in a long time whose general view of foreign policy was very, very nationalistic, very America first, very opposed to multilateral cooperation, very uncertain about remaining in alliances, very unwelcoming of U.S. military forces applied abroad, prepared to withdraw forces from countries in the region, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So you had, while he was a very idiosyncratic and unpredictable president, he was also somebody who broadened the scope of the discussion of foreign policy in the United States to include talking about a different kind of U.S. presence overseas, a different set of alliance relationships, a withdrawal from cooperation. It was a most unusual presidency in that regard. And what has happened now is that because Donald Trump continues to have an influence on the Republican Party in the United States, the Republican Party has begun to adopt some, not all, of the precepts that seem to become clear through the years of the Trump presidency about not cooperating with allies, emphasizing U.S. military strength, U.S. Unilateralism, cooperation, even intimacy with Russia, areas of foreign policy which were most unexpected. So we now have a rather deep split, I would say, between the most Republican voters and most Democratic Party voters with respect to what are the important issues and how should the United States engage the world.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about multilateralism. Given the United States' divide on governments' multilateral priorities, to what extent do you believe that public opinion might affect the outcome of decisions made when it comes to the direction of foreign policy?
Here's the thing about foreign policy and American elections. American elections, the Americans are a rather insular population. They don't focus a lot of time and attention on things that are happening overseas, which means most American elections don't turn on foreign policy issues. It's the rare election that does. Those come second. Vietnam may be said to have had an impact on the 1968 presidential election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. 1980, maybe, when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, who was running for his second term. But what is most compelling about foreign policy issues in American elections is not the policies themselves. Those rarely determine elections, but how the public views the reputation of the United States overseas and the capability of the person running for office to actually be a strong leader. Strong leadership is the one area which does seem to play an important role. John Kerry learned that in 2004 to his disadvantage, because the Republicans successfully pointed out that his service in Vietnam was uncertain and boastful and not what he claimed it to be. That suggested that he was a weak leader, not that Vietnam policy was wrong, but that he was potentially a weak leader. It was inaccurate, but it was effective, which often happens in American elections. So I don't see the Republican view right now as determining policy so much as it will lay a background for elections in terms of people seeing somebody as a symbol of strength. And that's the one thing that Donald Trump apparently conveyed, was that he was very strong. It doesn't follow what policies would happen, but that he was very strong.
Turning our attention a little bit about media portrayal. Now, when it comes to people falling into what's called a media bubble, to what extent are outside events or other critical points of view perhaps excluded from being able to help people make an informed decision about foreign policy decisions? And if you could tell us about the potential impact of this in American society.
Yes, you do find, and I think this is a new development in American politics, including domestic policy as well as foreign, and that is that this is now a very divided nation. And it's not only divided because people have different points of view, but it's divided because the media are now divided themselves. There was an interesting Pew poll last month that basically said Republicans tend to follow things like Fox News, radio commentators like the late Rush Limbaugh. The Democrats tend to follow sources like the network television, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. These sources tend to be sources that are read by people to the left of the political spectrum. What that means is we're really seeing now dispensed two completely divergent views of America in the world, American foreign policy, also domestic policy. And there is no balance in those views on either side, really. CNN and the New York Times, I would argue, retain a certain amount of balance. But even there's been increasing reluctance to display what is sometimes called fake news from the right of the American media spectrum. So now the big media sources are competing with each other and focusing on their audience, not on a general audience. I come from the generation that used to watch the evening news, which was pretty fair, balanced stuff. I find myself almost incapable of consuming what's on television today and among those sources, because you're no longer viewing news, you're viewing opinion. What that means, I think, is it tends to drive the Americans in a more insular direction. The left views the world with important issues like climate change and pandemics and international cooperation as being an important place for the United States. The right tends to view things like military strength and anti-immigration as driving their views of the foreign policy of the United States, and they don't talk to each other. And the media don't talk to each other either. So what you're seeing is this polarization of the American media spectrum, which only reinforces the polarization in American society and American politics. It's not educating the American people anymore, it's dividing them.
Now, you mentioned the recent Pew poll that came out. In your professional opinion in general, what kind of social or perhaps economic factors might lead American audiences to regard government foreign policy focus areas in either one direction or another? I know that you touched a little bit about those factors, but in a more generalized sense.
The audiences that watch these different sets of media, some very right and some middle to left, are very different people as well. And this, the Pew poll did not focus on so much. It would have been interesting if they had. It would have been interesting to see what the ethnic diversity breakdown was of the people that they polled amongst the Republicans and amongst the Democrats. I rather suspect, but I haven't seen their raw data, so I don't know if they collected it. I rather suspect that the Republicans tended to be older, more male and white, and the Democrats tended to be younger, more ethnically mixed, and more representative of the gender distribution of American society. Pew didn't offer us how those differences in ethnicity and sociological standing and economic standing affect the views that are there, but other polling suggests that by and large, the older the voter is, the more they are white, the more they are male, and the less they have a college education, the more they are likely to take views that emphasize military strength, follow the leader, strong men, a view of the world that is very, if you will, Hobbesian. And the audience that views these media on the center to the left of the political spectrum tend to favor international cooperation, tend to favor working with allies, tend to favor the view that we can't really solve a lot of the world's problems through military force or by the US alone, tend to focus on things like climate change and health issues. In other words, they're more likely to be on that end of the policy spectrum as well. Geographically, that just divides the country basically in most states. You have states that tend to be CNN, New York Times, MSNBC viewers, and you have states, principally South, Midwest, who tend to be Fox News, Rush Limbaugh viewers, and they are divided from each other. And what's critical here is that there's no arena, because the parties now in Washington reflect that division. There's no arena in which those can be compromised.
Thank you for that insight. Now, the same Pew Research recently revealed that the majority of Americans are feeling a little bit more confident in Biden's handling as his foreign policy term begins. Now, especially in this fragile transitional period for American leadership, what do you make of that?
That is a little bit too early to tell. Biden hasn't yet encountered the kind of pushback and problem that all presidents encounter. He has the huge advantage of being non-Trump. He is calm, he's collected, he thinks through policy issues, he gives his staff a lot of leeway. You don't see the kind of turmoil in Washington that we saw for 4 years under the Trump administration. All of that tends to convey to most American people, but again, media is divided here, the view that this is a steady hand at the till. And you can expect him to reason things through and to work problems through. The biggest issues for Biden, of course, are domestic policy issues. If his vaccine strategy succeeds, if the economy begins to return to normal, if employment begins to tick upwards, all of those are going to be more determinative of his foreign policy than anything else directly involved in foreign policy. There were two things in the Pew poll, however, that I found quite interesting. And that was the point where both the Fox, Rush Limbaugh viewers and the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC viewers agreed. Quite interesting. One was on the importance of jobs, and that emphasizes what I talked about earlier. Everybody on both sides of the political spectrum places a very high priority on creating employment and restoring the health of the American economy. So if Biden succeeds, he stands the possibility of gaining support. The other thing they agreed on is somewhat more disturbing, and that is viewing China as the principal adversary or the enemy of the United States. On the far right, the watchers of Fox and radio broadcasters use the word enemy to describe China. And that's been reinforced, I think, sadly, by the Biden administration, because they too have portrayed China as the principal adversary of the United States, as the country that needs to be contained, as the country that needs to be dealt with, as the country around which we have to focus military planning. In other words, both sides have been kind of putting out a message that China is the focus of U.S. foreign policy and it's an adversarial relationship. That does not bode well for our relationship with China, nor for the understanding of the American people about the sophistication with which China approaches the world. But it is now confrontational and, interestingly enough, on both sides of the political spectrum.
Dr. Gordon Adams, Professor Emeritus of United States Foreign Policy at the American University in Washington, as well as non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington, in light of the new Pew Research report. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. It's so important to break down these surveys and really look at the numbers and the facts behind those numbers. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. 2 U.S. Senate committees released a joint report on Thursday. The document said that the entities responsible for securing and protecting the Capitol were not prepared. To discuss elements of this report, Scott Gack is joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. January 6th, insurrection, protest, riot, attack, or whatever you may want to call it, continues to remain in debate. One by one, people are still being arrested. Debate still is going on. Bipartisan commission, which agreed to be bipartisan, fell apart because there were not enough votes. But there is some report. It is being called Giant Report, which has come out. To discuss that with us is Scott Gack, who is a professor at the Trinity College. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
So tell us, what are the major findings of this so-called Giant investigation?
Well, the report is, 128 pages. Its purpose, as written in the actual report, is that this report addresses the security planning and response failures of the entities involved or directly involved for Capitol security. So that's in this report that's marked as the United States Capitol Police, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. A notable omission from this report is really any language or investigation of the Department of Justice, which is supposedly the entity that was overseeing all of this, but members of the Department of Justice refused to cooperate with this bipartisan committee. So we know the purpose was to look quite specifically at security planning and responses. Well, that leaves us with a lot of questions, right? Because security planning responses doesn't get to the actual, and you marked it in several different words, the riot, the insurrection, the protest, and those are important words, right? They signify how we are to understand what took place. And so just by looking at this institutional response, why wasn't the Capitol defended, doesn't answer the question that I think many people would like to have answered, which is, why was the Capitol attacked? And so in this, you start to see the bipartisan nature of the report that was created. In the end, the conclusion, you can start to see some of the tensions in the committee by the time you get to the conclusion, which says that it's a riot that was an attack on democracy. And I take that to mean that democracy as a physical institution, the Capitol building, but also democracy as a process, right? The Congress was in the midst of certifying electoral votes on January 6th, and so kind of these two pillars of democracy as a process and also as a literal building and institution were under attack, and that's kind of marked out in this report.
Marked out meaning it was there and was taken out?
No. I mean actually in the report. Like the attack on democracy is definitely in the report.
So they are highlighting that. So it means there is some bipartisanship which is working here.
I would say so, but I would also say it must be intention, because there are some curious aspects to this report, such as an appendix that includes President Trump's address on January 6th. It's not really marked out in the report at any moment. The sitting president's actions are not really framed in this report. The report's very much focused on the institutions, the U.S. Capitol Police, the FBI, etc., not on the persons who participated in the riot or the actions of the president. Yet there's an appendix, which I would have to presume Democrats pushed to an appendix that includes President Trump's speech that day. I would have to presume that that's a Democratic addition to the file, and it makes it a very curious document for historians going forward. In many ways, for the silences in the report, more so than for what's actually in it. But maybe we should talk about a little bit about what's in it and what the conclusion.
So is this the silence is the one which surprised you the most, or there are some other elements which surprise you about this report?
Well, I think there are some curious things first. I don't think the silence is, if this is, and it is, a bipartisan committee report, silences are to be expected. But what's in it is that the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Capitol Police all had access to information about a planned attack on January 6th, and none of these various institutions believed or assessed this threat as kind of a viable threat. And there is questions, of course, that we can ask, and it's maybe easy for us at this moment to ask those questions because we know what happened, and they are obviously operating before anything happened. But why they didn't believe that, and there's very clear language of writings on websites and messages that were found that suggest that, hey, this is a serious threat. The U.S. Capitol Police knew that maps of the Capitol building and the tunnel system that's under the Capitol building were being shared widely. They knew there were messages that said, and here I'm quoting from the report, a message on a website that said, "Surround every building with a tunnel entrance/exit. They better dig a tunnel to China if they want to escape." And there are lots of examples of this kind of rhetoric, and the trick, and this is where the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security kind of have hid behind, is that they claim that they were unable to discern the difference between allowing free speech and a credible threat of violence. Right? At what point do you decide that somebody is that their speech is actually indicating?
So I wonder if some of those people who are talking this thing have named Ahmad or Abdullah or Muhammad, they will have this much difficulty in discerning about this speech and what is about to happen.
I mean, your point is absolutely on point, and there's a part in the report where the Department of Defense begins to, or at least the members of the Department of Defense claim that because of the heavy criticism that they received for flying helicopters and other heavy-handed approaches to peaceful protests in the wake of the George Floyd incident in the previous summer, that they were, for lack of a better term, gun shy for the January 6th event, because they wanted to shield themselves from such criticism. However, your point that the racial makeup of these rioters, their whiteness, their strong ties to military institutions, either federal military institutions, local police departments, and of course their support of a sitting president, all seemed to in some way shield them or make it difficult for authorities to believe that they would act in a violent manner, even though they were saying it and planning it.
Not that the Department of Defense itself, the Secretary of Defense, Austin, has given stand-down orders for military to look into extremism. Does this report, a bipartisan report, mention the fact that 10% or so were veterans who were involved in January 6th attacks?
No, this report largely, again, stays away from the protesters themselves and the things we learned, such the statistic that you just mentioned, the kind of significant participation of former military members in this riot. Those things on that, this report is largely silent.
So will that be true to say that it is sort of an internal review of the defense of the property?
Yeah, I mean, this is in many ways a report that says that all the communications between all these different security organizations collapsed in some way, shape, or form. But what the report doesn't ever answer is that important question of really, I mean, why there was a collapse. There are recommendations, of course, for enhanced communications between all these institutions, but it really always comes back down to the significant fact that the assessment of a threat was not provided, even though the information was there. And had there been an appropriate assessment of the threat, that information, there were already channels in existence well before this that could have worked here.
What is the vocabulary they're using? Are they calling it insurrections, riot, protest, attack, or all the above? And
it tends to vary a little. In the conclusion, the term riot is actually used, and I imagine that is a bit of a contentious. There were some contentious moments in trying to figure that out. In many instances, when you have a bipartisan commission in U.S. history, when the commission can't agree on a single report, right? You'll have a majority report and a minority report. In this case, we don't. We just have a singular report, and so one would imagine that it was that there was a lot of hand wringing over the language that was deployed.
Mm-hmm. Now, what happened to the original idea of a bipartisan commission, which is highly powered, and instead of just looking inward, we'll look into who came and why did they show up on January 6th?
Well, that idea of a commission has failed. Republicans have fought successfully against it, and one has to presume, as a result of their resistance to such a committee, it has to do with what they believe will be close ties, if not directly between, of course, the sitting president at the time and the protesters, at least within the inner workings of Republican members of Congress, their association with some of their constituents who did take part in this riot.
Do you think there is a possibility, now that the Congress cannot do bipartisan, full-fledged investigation of that, and FBI and the law enforcement will be going after each individual cases, will we ever have a complete picture of what actually transpired, why Justice Department was paralyzed? I mean, internal different groups and FBI and this and that, their report is coming through this bipartisan report. But the mother of all these institutions, Justice Department paralysis, is not being discussed. Administration, what they were doing is not discussed. White House papers and record of the conversation are not part of that. So is there any other possibility of any other investigation which will help America know and learn for the future?
That's an excellent question. If we, of course, don't know actually what's going on in the current Department of, and I don't mean this as some kind of conspiracy theory here, we don't know what's going on in the Department of Justice in terms of an investigation into this beyond, of course, the prosecution of the individuals who are involved. Once we have a fuller detail, and obviously we have some details from those arrests and those court cases are ongoing of the individuals who are involved. we'll obviously have a significant record from those which appear to be hundreds of cases. And once kind of as a greater news society, we're able to kind of distill all those cases and understand them. I mean, I think that's an important thing. What you suggested just now about kind of upper level administration, presidential kind of communications, those things I mean, those would be great to have, but I don't have high hopes on actually getting a record of those.
You see, considering that democracy is a risk, I mean, democracy does not stay at one level. We know the world, we know what happens, we know what happened in the history. Sort of democratic participation of Hitler and all of those history is not very far in human memory. Are we sure that democracy will move on with whatever the current things, current stage of affairs in our country?
Again, an excellent question. If I could look into the future, I would give you a better answer than this, which is that, you know, democracy is something we all have to work at every day, and there is an important aspect of accountability and transparency that ideally goes along with that system. But we know democracy, if democracy is defined as the ability for, you know, as many citizens of a nation as possible to provide a political voice through the ballot, through voting, and then of course have the appropriate representation as the system allows. We know democracy is quite literally under attack in many states and in many places throughout the United States, where the ability to vote, which seems like, you know, a system that calls itself a democracy should always be making it easier for people to vote rather than more difficult. We know that democracy in that sense is very much under attack. And the events of January 6th suggest that it's under attack in even other ways beyond the actual voting process, that even legitimate outcomes of elections are suddenly under question. I mean, this is both more, it's always tough to know. Like one day you'll feel like, oh, well, it's okay. Things are going to kind of turn out right, because they always have, if you would. Like they've been contested, and we've battled for the rights to vote in many different ways over time. But you know, something like January 6th, I personally would I agree with your line of questioning. I would much rather have full disclosure of leadership's role in the response to this. But I do think at least we'll get a decent look into motivations for individuals who participated.
Do you think it will help if a non-governmental, not congressional, a commission comes into being in the private sector, in the not-for-profit sector, of academicians and scholars and former administrators from the government, to have an open air commission to come up with and in the societal sense, it could be bipartisan instead of just being a partisan commission. Do you think their contribution will matter?
Obviously, it always depends on exactly how something like that is set up and what kind of access a committee of that nature would have. If it has the backing of the federal government in some way, shape, or form, if it is a presidential commission that's set up in with a kind of bipartisan mindset, I think that would be, you know, Congress seems particularly embattled in the last few years, and it seems difficult to for lawmakers to work together to find out a kind of greater truth, if you would. But a commission of that nature certainly could be quite influential.
Well, thank you so much, Stonkek, for your time. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you, Mama Jahid and Mr. Gak. That's all from our Washington studio tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube and Facebook pages. Make sure to like and subscribe. For more insightful content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.